1,000 years ago, before the fall, there were kingdoms of machines. Machines of a magic contrived by the isolation and exaggeration of men's brains. Such wonders there were to drive a man mad. But these grand machines were bred of the mind only. Their makers knew nothing of spirit. Mental mechanisms lived on poisons and excreted poisons. No matter how they were made, the machines always had the same effect. They separated people from one another. And yet the people fell in love with machines and began a long and costly affair. The machine life, as it was called, was hailed as the triumph of man over nature. Fish could fall from the sky, but there would be a machine to set it right. In the golden age of machines, John Kennedy was born and rose to be king of a huge and violent land. He had great wisdom, a manly thing and a good heart, and he married a beautiful young woman named Jacqueline Onassis. The people loved them and followed them everywhere. There was a man who was born to love machines. His name was Adolf Hitler. He had a power over money and machines, just as JFK had a power over men's hearts. But while Kennedy loved peace, Hitler loved war and the machines of war. He kept men in small white rooms, wearing white clothes, and tormented them until they could produce more powerful and more cunning machines. If a man denounced Hitler or the millions of homeless displaced by his factories, Hitler was very polite. Politeness was everything for makers of machines. Instead, he plotted secretly, and secretly had his enemies killed. But out of his factories came a stream of astonishing magical machines. The population was enchanted. Supernatural acts these were, flying, walking on water, and cutting things up into very small pieces. But most of all, they were entranced by a machine called the theater in the air. A metal eye would observe some great spectacle, and suddenly people everywhere would see it and hear it in small boxes called televisions. Selling these and other machines, Hitler became wealthy beyond imagining. He married the woman whose seductive figure had helped to sell many of his machines, Mary Monroe. Everywhere they went, the metal eye spied on them, and the millions of entranced observers watched them in the televisions. Though he tried, Kennedy could do nothing to break the enchantment that machine life held over the people. As the years passed, they became more and more ridiculous, paralyzed in a state of frightened passivity. Jealous of their new machines and their treasures, they lost all notion of who might have created their world and what it was for. JFK despaired for his country. Himself in a constant state of befuddlement from the barrage of machines whispering in his ear, he began to drink heavily. He had mechanisms implanted in his skin to amplify his senses, which otherwise were numb. Wine became his constant companion, and then he began inviting young women up to his chambers at night. His wife knew of this but kept silent, weeping at night when she was alone. One night, during a feast to celebrate a particularly handsome and clever machine, Kennedy became greatly intoxicated and by mistake took Hitler's wife Mary into his bed. She fell in love with him and became his secret mistress. When Hitler was told of this, he flew into a rage. He swore to see Kennedy dead. In his secret rooms, he built a deadly flying knife and devised a plan to lure JFK into the open. He played on Kennedy's pride and persuaded him to lead a procession through the Capitol. As JFK sat in the machine carriage and waved to the crowd, he held his wife's hand and thought about everything he had done. And the flying knife struck.
The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. Mrs. Kennedy jumped up and grabbed Mr. Kennedy. She called, "Oh no!" The motorcade sped on.
JFK was dead. The flying knife had struck him in the heart and then turned upward through his chest to shatter his skull. The back of his head fell on his wife's lap and she began to scream. For a time she was quite mad and had to be cared for. Hitler replaced the back of Kennedy's head and hid the body in a great flying machine. The machine never landed, but followed the sun, circling endlessly high above the earth. Hitler declared himself king in Kennedy's absence. When she heard the news of Kennedy's death, Mary Monroe was posing for the metal eye in the desert. She became quite distracted, crying and ripping her clothes. She swore she would find JFK and restore him to life. But she soon fell into incoherence and sat in her rooms drinking wine from dawn to dusk. This went on for months. No one could rouse her or tear her away from her beloved bottles of wine. Hitler's best doctors killed hundreds of men and women in scientific experiments, trying to solve the mystery of alcohol's spell over Mary. She became known as the Sleeping Beauty, though sleep was the one oblivion she found less and less often. No one knows what did in fact cure Mary Monroe's madness. One day she simply left her room and walked out of her husband's life. She neither spoke to Hitler nor tasted wine again for the rest of her life. It was said that she had had a vision of her creator, and he had forgiven her and given her her freedom, on the condition that she always keep him in her heart. Mary Monroe traveled across the lands, searching